The ring slipped from the tray, hit the marble floor, and spun once before Daniel Reyes could even breathe. And in that single, ringing second, the whole restaurant seemed to hold its breath with him. He had walked into the Hartwell Grand that evening the way he walked into every room now. Quietly, without fanfare, in a gray coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent, but with eyes that carried something heavier than money ever could. Daniel Reyes was 46 years old, and by every measure the world used to define success, he had already won. He owned 3 companies, a foundation with his name on it, and a penthouse that overlooked the city like a throne overlooks a kingdom. But none of that mattered on the nights when the silence in his apartment grew too loud, when the empty side of his bed felt like an accusation, when he remembered a woman named Clara who used to hum while she cooked, and a mother who had raised him with nothing but calloused hands and unshakable love before illness took her 12 years ago. Daniel had built an empire, but he had built it alone, brick by brick, over a grave he never let himself visit. He came to this restaurant every Thursday because it was the one place where no one recognized his face, where the maitre d' didn't fawn over him, where he could simply be a tired man eating soup in a corner booth. That particular Thursday, the waitress who approached his table was new. She moved with a kind of practiced grace that spoke of exhaustion carefully hidden, her uniform a size too big, her smile warm despite the ache visible beneath her eyes. Her name tag read Marisol. She took his order with polite efficiency, and as she reached to steady a wobbling glass of water on his table, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal a ring on a thin chain around her wrist, not her finger, a ring she clearly could not bear to wear, only to carry. Daniel's hand froze around his water glass. The ring was silver, oxidized with age, with a small sapphire stone chipped at one corner, and an engraving so faint most people would never have noticed it. But Daniel noticed it, because he had spent years of his childhood watching that exact ring catch the light on his mother's hand while she stirred soup on their old stove. It was not just similar. It was identical down to the chip, down to the engraving, down to the way the sapphire sat slightly crooked in its setting, the way it had after his father had it resized decades ago by a jeweler who never got it quite right. Before he could stop himself, words left his mouth, quiet and disbelieving. "Where did you get that ring?" Marisol glanced down at her wrist, suddenly self-conscious, and pulled her sleeve down instinctively, the way people do when something precious feels exposed to judgment. She offered an apologetic smile, and said only that it had been her mother's, that her mother had passed 3 years ago, and that she wore it close to her skin because if she wore it on her finger, she was terrified she'd lose it waiting tables, or worse, someone would notice its value, and she couldn't afford for anyone to ask questions. She said it lightly, the way people learn to say heavy things when they've had to say them too many times. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, that her mother used to say the ring was the only thing of real worth she owned, a gift from a young man decades ago, who loved her before life pulled them apart in ways neither of them chose. Daniel sat frozen, his soup forgotten, his pulse loud in his own ears. He asked, carefully, trying not to let his voice shake, what her mother's name had been. Marisol hesitated, unsure why a stranger in an expensive coat suddenly looked like the floor had opened beneath him, but she answered, Elena. Elena Cruz. And in that instant, 30 years collapsed into a single breathless moment. Because Daniel Reyes had once loved a woman named Elena Cruz with everything he had, before poverty and pride, and a father who forbade the match tore them apart when Daniel was barely 20, broke, and powerless to stop it. He remembered giving her that ring on a bridge overlooking a river neither of them could name anymore, promising her a future he did not yet have the strength to build. He remembered her tears when his family sent him away to another city for what they called opportunity. He remembered writing letters that were never answered, never knowing that his father had intercepted every single one. If this story means something to you already, if you believe people deserve second chances, and that kindness can still find its way back to us in the most unexpected moments, take a second right now to like this video, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Corner so you never miss a story like this one. Daniel asked, voice unsteady now, if he could see the ring more closely, and Marisol, though confused, unclasped the chain and placed it gently in his palm. He turned it over with trembling fingers, and there, on the inside of the band, exactly where he remembered it, was an engraving too small for most eyes to catch. D and E, forever bound. He had commissioned that engraving himself, sold his only watch to pay for it, at 19 years old, believing with his whole reckless heart that forever was something a poor young man could promise a woman he loved. He looked up at Marisol, this stranger with tired eyes and a name tag and a mother's ring around her wrist, and understood with a certainty that shook him to his foundation that he was looking at his own daughter. He did not say it then. He could not. The words lodged in his throat like stones, because what do you say to a young woman working a double shift to pay her rent? A young woman who has no idea that the man sitting in front of her spent decades quietly searching hospital records and old addresses for a woman named Elena, only to eventually be told, wrongly, by an assistant hired 30 years ago, that Elena had moved abroad and remarried. A lie Daniel had believed because he was too broken and too proud to keep chasing a door that seemed permanently closed. He had built his empire on that grief, disguising heartbreak as ambition, telling himself that if he could not have the family he wanted, he would at least build something that mattered. Instead, he asked Marisol gently if she had time to sit for a moment, if her shift allowed a short break, because he wanted to tell her something about her mother that he thought she deserved to know. Marisol, sensing something in his voice that was not threatening but trembling with a strange, aching sincerity, glanced toward her manager, who waved her off with the kind of understanding only fellow working people extend to one another. She sat across from him, cautious but curious, and Daniel began to speak, slowly at first, then faster, as 30 years of silence finally broke open. He told her about a bridge and a river and a promise made too young. He told her about a father's cruelty disguised as protection, about intercepted letters, about a young man who believed he had been abandoned when in truth he had been the one erased. He told her that Elena Cruz had once been the only person who made him believe he was worth loving before wealth ever touched his name. Marisol listened with growing stillness, her hands trembling slightly around a napkin she had begun folding and unfolding without noticing. And when Daniel finally said the words, gently, carefully, that he believed her mother might have been carrying his child when they were separated, that he believed, based on the ring, the dates, the engraving, that he might be looking at his own daughter, Marisol's folded napkin fell from her fingers entirely. She said, barely above a whisper, that her mother had never spoken of her father, only that he was a good man who life had taken from her, a man she never stopped loving even decades later, even on the hospital bed where she died 3 years ago, still whispering a name Marisol had always assumed was simply grief speaking. Daniel asked, throat tight, what that name was. Marisol looked at him with eyes suddenly brimming, and said it was Daniel. The restaurant around them blurred into irrelevance. Neither of them cared about the other diners, the clattering dishes, the ordinary rhythm of a Thursday evening continuing obliviously around the collision of two lives that had been separated by a lie for 30 years. Daniel reached across the table, not as a billionaire, not as a man who commanded boardrooms, but as a father discovering his daughter in the most unimaginable way, and asked if he could hold her hand, just for a moment, if that was all right. Marisol, tears finally falling freely, nodded, and in that touch, something both of them had carried unknowingly their entire lives, a hollow ache neither could fully name, began, for the first time, to heal. Over the weeks that followed, DNA confirmed what the ring and the engraving and 30 years of quiet grief had already told them was true. Daniel did not simply insert himself into Marisol's life with money, though he made certain she never again had to work double shifts to survive. He showed up instead the way a father should, awkwardly at first, learning her laugh, her stubbornness, the way she hummed while she cooked, an unconscious echo of a mother neither of them could bring back, but both of them could finally honor properly. He visited Elena's grave for the first time in 30 years, this time not alone, but with the daughter Elena had raised with quiet dignity despite having every reason to grow bitter. He knelt there and apologized to a woman who could no longer hear him, and somehow, that was enough, because the daughter beside him heard every word. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that kindness and truth have a way of finding us even after decades of silence, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to believe in second chances today. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach the people who need them most. Before you go, we would love to hear from you. Comment below with the words second chances if you believe, as we do, that it is never too late for the truth to bring two hearts home to each other. Daniel Reyes never wore his wealth like armor again. Instead, he wore, quietly, on a simple chain beneath his shirt, a ring with a chipped sapphire and an engraving that had waited 30 years to be understood, a reminder that the things we think we've lost forever sometimes return to us wearing an apron and carrying a tray, waiting simply for someone to finally recognize them.